Greetings, I'm Jeff Scheuer. Thank you for coming to today's Fireside chat with Dr. Donna Hicks. I'll read you guys a brief bio. It's been great talking to Donna the last few weeks. Donna is an associate at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs at Harvard University. She facilitated dialogues in numerous unofficial diplomatic efforts in the Middle East, Sri Lanka, and various other countries. And she was a consultant to the BBC in Northern Ireland, where she co-facilitated a television series, Facing the Truth, with Archbishop Desmond Tutu. She's taught courses in conflict resolution at Harvard, Clark, and Columbia universities, and conducts training seminars in the US and abroad on dignity leadership training and on the role dignity plays in resolving conflict. She recently published her second book, Leading with Dignity: How to Create a Culture that Brings Out the Best in People, which is what we'll be discussing today. So thank you for joining us.
My pleasure.
So I would love for you to just tell us a little bit about why you decided to write this book.
The second book. Well, I wrote the first book because, as Jeff pointed out, I had been working in the field of international conflict resolution for 25 years and realized that when we were bringing these parties together for dialogues all over, as Jeff pointed out, in the Middle East and Asia, Africa, North America, South America, everywhere there was a hot conflict, my organization was usually involved, unofficially, in the back channel. And we would try to bring these people together for dialogue, and we had the best and the smartest and the most motivated, high-level, influential people sitting at these tables trying to work out their differences. And believe me, there was no shortage of intellectual ideas about how to do this. But what happened was there was a big emotional undercurrent that was always taking place in these dialogues. And they would wreak havoc on our ability to try to come together. We'd get really close to trying to figure out how to make a compromise on an issue, and something would happen and there would be an emotional tsunami, and that was it. So one day I'm thinking, I think we're having the wrong conversation here. We shouldn't be talking about the politics. We should be talking about these emotional upheavals that are getting in the way of people being able to resolve their differences. It's not like they're not motivated to do it. There's something else going on. And what I realized, very long story short, because I could tell you about this for the whole time, but the very essence of what I discovered about why these emotional reactions were overtaking the processes, what I realized was that it was about their dignity. It was about feeling like, how dare you treat us this way? Or don't you see we're human beings? How can you not want to bring an end to this suffering? We're all human beings here. So once I had that word in my mind, that this was about dignity, I started searching. I started looking in the literature about how can we get to this issue of dignity? How can we work with it and have that conversation first before we start talking about the political issues that divide them? And so fast forward, I read all the literature. There was an abundance of it in the philosophy departments, philosophy literature, but it was not practical knowledge. I wanted to know how to work with people. I wanted to know, how can we end this source of human suffering? There must be a way that we can figure out how to work with this dignity concept. So I did. Took me 7 years to figure out how to do it, but at one point I was working in Colombia in South America and decided I'm going to try this for the first time, working with the dignity issues. And it was a very difficult conflict between the military and the Department of Defense, and there was big, terrible conflict in the media. It was all over the place. And when I got together with these two groups, I told them, I said, look, I have a feeling that the issues that are dividing you and are creating this conflict have to do with your dignity. And if you don't mind, I said, I want to spend 2 days talking about it. Would you be willing? And do you know, I asked them, would you be willing to talk about a time when you felt your dignity was dishonored in this conflict? Every person raised his or her hand. each one said, yes, I am willing to do it. So I knew there was something under there. And by the end, this one general came up to me, who wasn't even giving me eye contact in the beginning, and he's rolling his eyes at me. And he said, Don, I've got to hand it to you. After 2 days, you certainly did help us repair this relationship in the room with dignity. But more importantly, I think you saved my marriage. So it was at that point, Jeff, that I realized I wasn't just dealing with international conflict issues. I was dealing about something fundamentally human. Fundamentally core human desire to be treated as if we mattered and to be treated as if we have value and worth. And once I started working with people with that and my book came out, well, it touched a nerve in the corporate world, it touched a nerve in healthcare, in education, and since then, I've been working a lot with schools, a lot with private schools across the country. And once I started going into those different arenas, not my international conflict work, but into corporations and in hospitals and so on, once I got in there, I realized that if the leadership of these organizations, whether it was schools or whatever it was, businesses, if they weren't on board, if they didn't embrace this idea that everybody needed to be treated with dignity in the workplace, nothing would happen. Nothing would happen. So the reason I wrote this book was because I felt that I had captured and made very practical ways in which we could address these dignity issues in our workplace, in schools, and to figure out how to address the toxic elements in a culture, the dysfunctional elements. And lo and behold, I've been in many, many, many of these organizations now. And every single one of them, whether it's in the school system, no matter where it is, you've named our problem. We have a problem with people feeling like they're not being treated well. And this is astonishing, because when I went into the corporate world for the first time and I interviewed employees and asked them how they were doing, I have these 10 elements of dignity, which I'll share with you in a minute. I would ask them, well, which of these elements of dignity do you feel are violated here? And the one element that 80% of the people whom I interviewed, the one element was the element of safety. People did not feel safe, not so much physically unsafe, but they didn't feel safe to speak up when something bad happened to them at work. That culture there wasn't an ecosystem in that culture that enabled people to be authentic, to be open, to be, unfearful of giving feedback to the person who violated them. So
yeah,
that's
really
why
helpful.
I wrote the book. Yeah, because I realized we're experiencing an epidemic of indignity. And it's not just here in this country, it's global. It's a global epidemic. And I'm hoping that leadership in these organizations will embrace it, will take it seriously, and will do what it takes to create these cultures where people not only feel like they can be safe, but where people feel like they can flourish. And I think dignity can take us there.
And so let's define our terms a little bit. How do you define addressing somebody's dignity versus leading with empathy or leading with respect? Mm-hmm. What is the difference between those terms?
So I think that there's a big difference between dignity and respect, and I'll tell you why. Dignity is something that I have discovered is something inherent in all of us. Every single human being has dignity. And in fact, I think we were born with dignity. And if I were to have done a PowerPoint here, I would have right now showed you a picture of a beautiful little infant child, in his father's hands. And I would have said to you, is there any doubt in your mind that this little one, this precious newborn, has value and worth inherent in his being or her being? And so dignity is something that is part of our birthright. We all have it. We don't have to do anything to have dignity. Now, by the way, we all are born with dignity, but we're not born knowing how to act like it. So we need an educational component with it, which we'll talk about later. But The thing about respect, so we all deserve dignity no matter what. It's our baseline of how we should be treating one another. But respect, on the other hand, I think has to be earned. Now, I say this, respect and trust both have to be earned. And I say this because in my international work, I would go into these conflicts where people would tell me, the other side stripped me of my dignity. They stripped us of our dignity. And that's why we're fighting, to regain our lost dignity. So, now I have to tell you, can I tell a brief story about Archbishop Tutu? No. Yes or no?
We can come back to that.
Okay. So the difference between, and remind him to come back to it because it's a great story. The difference between dignity and respect, I told my people with whom I was working in the international arena, the difference between dignity and respect is that I think you're asking for too much, because they would say, we demand respect from the other side. And I said, I think that's a bridge too far. I think what you need to ask for is to be treated as if you're a human being, treated as if you're a person with value and worth. Because honestly, Jeff, I think if we were able to get to the point where we were treating each other with dignity in all of our relationships, I think we'd see a far less violent world that we're living in. And so I think dignity and respect are different in that way. And I think with empathy, empathy is related. They're like kissing cousins, I think. They're very much related, because if you have empathy for someone, and empathy in my mind is just the ability to understand and feel the lived experience of other people. If we could get to that point, that would make it so much easier to honor their dignity.
So let's talk about the how. You've done some work in classrooms, worked with some really esteemed programs. When you're teaching students to have difficult conversations, what is your methodology for going about that, whether it's through role plays or through some types of tactical adjustments?
Well, my approach with dignity, no matter where I go, whether it's schools or in the international arena, in the workplace, my goal is always the same. It is what I call an educational approach to understanding how to live together, how to be together in schools, no matter where we are. And what I do is I spend the first, let's say I'm giving a workshop with my graduate students, because those are my students. What I do is I spend the first 2 days just giving them all the information and all the research that I've done on dignity. So it's an educational, what I say to them, you're going to be getting a Dignity 101 seminar first before we learn how to resolve conflict with it. Because once they understand all of the aspects of dignity, which I have uncovered through my research and I've developed, once they understand all of that, it becomes obvious how to have a difficult conversation. So in other words, the goal is to have a conversation in a way, even if you feel like you're have very opposing ideas. The idea is, how do we disagree with dignity? And another thing I do, what you were referring to, I think, are the reenactments. So in order to get students or people, anybody, to feel the lived experience of another and what it's like to have one of these dignity violations. By the way, we all know it. Every single one of us in this room has had violations to our dignity, there's no doubt. But what I do is I do these reenactments where I ask the students to tell me about a time when they felt their dignity had been violated. And then we reenact them on stage. And so everybody watches. And the whole point of that, Jeff, is not to keep this in their heads, because this isn't an intellectual exercise. Understanding dignity is a deeply emotional event. And so I want them to see, through reenacting the stories, what it was like for the person who was telling the story. And then I have these 10 elements of dignity, which are acceptance of identity, fairness, acknowledgement, recognition, giving people the benefit of the doubt, independence, and accountability. I missed a couple there. Anyway, but there's 10 of them. And they then match up the 10 elements of dignity. Safety, of course, I missed safety. whoops, they match up these elements of dignity with their story. And it shows them how obvious it was that the person felt so bad, because these 10 elements, normally all of them are violated in a story. So it really, and it develops the empathy that you were referring to earlier.
One of the elements of your book that may be more controversial to some is just this terminology of dignity violation. Mm-hmm. We're in a very polarized world right now. There's lots of rapidly changing norms about what's acceptable in different environments, and people aren't really sure what is the line between objective reality and my subjective reality and your subjective reality. So how do you differentiate what is a dignity violation versus what is just somebody feeling upset, but not necessarily because something has been done to them, but just because they have their own narrative, their own perception of reality?
Well, what I've done in my research to make this more objective is I've interviewed probably in the thousands at this point, people, and asked them to tell me about a time when they felt that their dignity had been violated. I ask, tell me a story. They tell me what they felt was happening. And then, and I did this all over the world, because I wanted to see if it was a universal phenomenon, this desire to be treated well. And so when I went all over the world, many of my students are international students, and asked them, what ended up by happening was that there were patterns in their stories. There were patterns that came through. The context might have been different in the story, but the underlying emotional experience was the same. It was usually about identity. It was usually about, something, people feeling discriminated against because of some aspect of their identity, their race, religion, ethnicity, so on. And it was usually about recognition. And this is how I came up with the 10 elements. So one of the things that I think really separates a perception from an actual dignity violation is the robustness of the reliability and validity of this instrument that I created, around feeling, because the story has to involve one of those 10 elements of dignity. And when they do, it's really clear. And the other thing that I do
what would be an example of that?
Of which?
Of a dignity violation.
Okay, so I hear stories, so many stories. So a student goes into a classroom, who may be of a different ethnicity or religion or race, or may be a minority or a person of color, and she walks into the classroom and she hears sneering remarks about her religion. Let's say it's about religion. She hears sneering remarks, and it's brutal. It's actually brutal for this woman, because she's already feeling isolated and marginalized, and here she's taunted. It's like bullying. Think of it as bullying. It's another way, I think, of describing what happens to people when they're bullied, tormented in some way. So that, or let's say, something happened in a situation where, well, with little kids, it's often around a sense of belonging also, where, say, somebody has a party and this one person was left out because of who knows why. But because we all want that sense of belonging, especially with social media now, it's so obvious with Facebook and all of the other platforms when they're being left out of something. So those are two examples.
Okay, great. So a big piece of the work that you do is helping leaders, is helping people in positions of authority understand better the impact that their actions have on others. And then what about on the other side? How do you help that girl who feels hurt because she's overheard remark about her religion, or somebody feels mistreated in the workplace? How do you work with folks to help them better advocate for themselves and be taken seriously?
Well, again, my strategy when I go into let's say I go into a school, and the very first thing I do is that educational piece. I give everybody the lessons in how to honor dignity, how to not violate your own dignity. These are all 10 things that we can do, the power of 10. And so they have the language It's the language that they can use to, let's say, confront someone who is bullying them. Or let's say you have another student standing by who comes in and says, wait, I think that was really inappropriate for you to say that. Or, I mean, a little kid wouldn't use the word inappropriate, but I think that might have been hurtful to her, the way you just talked to her. Is that really what you wanted to do? Did you want to, you know? So, and they, by the way, I don't suggest what they say. The teachers come up with all of this. The teachers have been brilliant with this. I give them the intellectual property. I give them the substance, the 10 elements of dignity and so on, and the teachers take it and work with it. So,
and it seems that so much of conflicts that emerge, and you've done a lot of work with conflict resolution, emerge because of fear, because of ignorance, because of misunderstanding. And so when things are as black and white as both people agree on the facts, then it's a little bit easier to remediate. But when one person's view is different from another person's view, when the person has made a comment and is unaware that her comment may have hurt somebody, how do you help those folks engage in that scenario?
well, again, they use the language of dignity. They use the tools that I give them, which is to say, you know, how do you defend your dignity? How do you actually approach a person who you felt has done harm? And the secret about that is to not do it when you're all upset and angry. The secret to this is that you want to create an environment where your own internal environment, where you're able to give that kind of feedback in a way that doesn't feel like a weapon and that you're returning the harm to the other person. So.
And as you were doing your research, you reference a lot of other works, Carol Dweck's Mindset,
Yeah.
and kind of a number of others. What are some of the authors and some of the studies that have had the biggest impact on you in terms of conflict resolution and self-advocacy?
Yeah. One of the biggest, and I was just about to say this, but one of the biggest benefits that I felt that I have gained from work that's been done outside of my field is in the world of social neuroscience. Because those of us who have been in these intractable conflicts with people who just can't seem to let go of the pain and the suffering that they've endured, neuroscience now has given us the evidence that we need to say, look, this dignity stuff matters. It matters the way you treat one another. Now, in particular, there's a book by Matthew Lieberman called Social, Why We're Wired to Connect. Brilliant, brilliant piece of work. He and his wife, Naomi Eisenberg, did some of the seminal work about showing the impact of these dignity violations. What they did was they put people in these fMRIs, you know, the brain scanners, and they exposed them to different scenarios. For example, they exposed them to a scenario where someone broke his arm, and they watched what part of the brain was illuminated during that experience of watching someone with a physical injury. And so what happened was they found out that the part of the brain that gets activated when you experience a physical wound is some area called the limbic system. It's the pain center. It's where we experience all the powerful emotions. One of the earliest parts of our brains to evolve. We shared this with mammals and reptiles and so on. And the thing is that that isn't so interesting, but what the interesting finding was that when they put people through scenarios where they'd had their dignity violated, the same part of the brain lit up when they experienced a wound to their dignity. The same part of the brain. So what that means is that the brain doesn't know the difference between experiencing a physical injury, the hurt that we feel there, and a dignity violation. That, to me, was astonishing. And so I went digging. Those were some of the first findings. Now that's been replicated over and over. So neuroscience has helped me so much to be able to take this on the road and to say to people, we have to pay attention to this. Because when they have physical evidence, you know, people like to see the physical evidence, before they embark on any kind of an intervention. Well, the physical evidence is there, and if it weren't for Matt and his wife, Naomi, because they were the first. So now it's just common knowledge. Now it's common knowledge that we have a language to put to these emotional issues and to show that the impact is profound on us.
So helping to give some vocabulary to folks who are feeling oppressed or feeling victimized and need some way to express that certainly is very powerful. How about the case where folks misuse that and maybe there's a policy passed at work that they just don't agree with personally, even if it actually doesn't directly affect them. And then they were to use that, the same vocabulary that you've championed, right? This is a violation of my dignity. It's not just something that I don't like, but it is violating my dignity. How do you help people differentiate between those two so that it doesn't become kind of weaponized?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, again, after their Dignity 101 seminar, they've had a lot of experience in how to give feedback to other people. So if you have a policy decision that was made that you were uncomfortable with and you felt you wanted to address it, in a dignity framing, you wouldn't go in there with a shotgun. You would go in there trying to seek a deeper understanding, because understanding is another element of dignity. You'd go in there and try to seek a deeper understanding of why the person or the committee or the people made the decision that they made. So not assuming that, because you want to give people the benefit of the doubt. And so anyway, that's how we would work with that.
You could only go in with a shotgun in some states, right?
Well, yes, that does, yeah.
Hopefully in no schools. So could you tell me a little bit more about the context of what that conversation should look like, where someone can have a conversation that says, hey, this is how I'm feeling. When you did this, I felt this way.
Yep, he's really into this question. I mean, this is like wonderful. This is good.
Well, it's one thing to have an emotion. It's one thing to feel attacked, but it's another thing to be able to bridge the gap tactically so that people can understand.
So what I would do if a person felt like her dignity was being violated, let's say, and it was by someone, maybe her supervisor, manager, someone who has authority and power over the relationship. These are the most challenging, because I'll start with that, because they are the most challenging. What I have been able to accomplish with people in organizations is instructing them how to give that feedback in a way so that it doesn't feel like a weapon. For example, one of the things that the people have come up with, a lot of people with whom I've worked have come up with different phrases, different words to use, different ways of approaching it. So the most effective way that we've found so far is to say, look, my relationship with you here at work is very important to me. And I really don't want anything to interfere with our relationship. Unfortunately, what happened yesterday in our staff meeting was very upsetting to me when you made a joke about me and everybody else laughed, but I felt humiliated. And I'm sure you didn't intentionally do it, because again, you want to give the benefit of the doubt. I don't think you really intended to do that, but I want to share that with you because it's interfering with our relationship now. I don't feel safe to speak to, I'm worried that you're going to do this again and it's going to feel equally as difficult and embarrassing for me. And usually when the person says just that opening line, my relationship with you is important to me. There's something about that. It's very hard for the person to get defensive because if you say, hey, look, I want to keep this relationship strong. I want to keep it viable. These are the golden words that we can use.
Yeah, those are some really, I think, strong and actionable tips of how to have tough conversations.
Yeah.
Why don't we open things up to people in the audience? What questions do folks have?
Yes, here's one. Oh, the story? The Tutu story. Okay, this is a great story. So when I was working with him in Northern Ireland, we were bringing victims and perpetrators of the conflict there together for face-to-face dialogue. And before we started, because these were very difficult, and the BBC was filming this whole thing, making them into television programs. So before we started, Tutu said to me, you know, Donna, I really would like to get to know you a little better. I had just met him just, you know, hours before, not hours before we were going to start, but, you know, we really wanted to spend some time together because we were co-facilitating these dialogues. And so he said to me, tell me more about your international work, how you arrived at this issue of dignity and why it was so important to you. And I said, sure. I said, well, what the parties would say to me is that they were stripped of their dignity and that they wanted to fight to regain that dignity. And Tutu looked at me and he like scrunched up his face and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, that's what they told me. They told me that they wanted to, you know, felt their dignity was stripped and they wanted to regain their dignity by fighting in these, to restore it. And he said, nobody can ever take away our dignity. And I just said, okay. And then he said to me, how do you think we got through apartheid? How do you think we managed the degradation, the humiliation, the dehumanization that we black Africans felt in South Africa during the apartheid regime? And he said, furthermore, he said, Nelson Mandela feels exactly the same way. When he went into Robben Island, you know, where he spent 27 years, the first thing he did was he wanted to see what the guards were up to because he thought, well, maybe we'll figure out how to survive. And what they discovered, Mandela says, what he discovered was the guards tried to strip us of our dignity. And he said, well, I was relieved to see that because I realized, he said, they were trying to strip us of our dignity, but nobody is going to win that fight, that battle over my dignity, because I am not willing to let it go for any man or any institution. So that was a sea change for me. That was a real eye-opener because I had thought that maybe people, because I'd heard it so much from people in these conflicts, and he said, don't ever perpetuate that myth, Donna. Wherever you go, you tell this story because I want people to know that their dignity is in their hands and in their hands only. And so, but that was also really empowering for me personally, just having that sense. And when I go around and do my Dignity 101 seminars, the first thing I do is to check in with people and ask them, how many people here feel a strong sense of their own dignity? And honestly, not very many people raise their hand. You know what they say to me? They say, I've never really thought about it. I've never really given it any thought, my dignity. And so it was this ignorance related and surrounding all of this issue of dignity that really made me crystallize my thinking about what we had to do here. We had to go on an educational campaign and give people this information about dignity, these very basic ideas about dignity, because it's something that we all yearn for and desire, and yet we know so little about it. So back to your original question, why did you write that book? It's the same reason I wrote the first book, because I wanted to contribute to reducing a source of human suffering that we could do something about. This is something we could do something about. So you had a question.
It was also Bishop Tutu, but since you called him, you'll ask another one.
Okay.
What are some things that an oppressed people or oppressed person, possibly a workshop on oppression, can do to support their own dignity?
Well, first of all, I was walking down the street here this morning, and have you seen that park over there with all the Martin Luther King blocks? They have all these quotes by Martin Luther King, and he said in one of them, which is so similar to what Tutu said, he said, if you were to ask me advice about how to make a blueprint for your life, he said, understand that you have dignity, and it is, it is the most fundamental thing for you to do first in your life, is to claim your dignity, is to claim your sense of value and worth, and basically not look on the outside for it, to have it recognized as another story. We all want to be treated with dignity, but to know that it's in there, it's such an empowering It's so empowering with oppressed groups. I mean, I've worked with many, many oppressed groups. And just having that language to know that their dignity is sacrosanct, it's in their hands, and nobody could strip them of it. But yes, of course, working for justice issues is equally as important. And then but they do it from that base of a strong internal emotional scaffolding. And he also, Martin Luther King also said the one thing that we learned from the civil rights movement was to own our dignity. It's really powerful.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us, Donna. And thank you, everybody, for joining.
Thank you.